If you've ever looked into the eyes of a gorilla or a chimpanzee, you know that feeling, that unexpected jolt of recognition, almost like you're looking into a very distant mirror. Their expressions, their curiosity, the way they play and even problem solve. We're not as different as we might think. So, welcome to Wild About Wildlife. I'm your host, Kathy Mueller, and this month we're diving into the world of great apes. My guest is Dr. Rick Quinn, a veterinarian from southwestern Ontario, whose career took a little bit of a twist when he discovered a passion for great apes and became a staunch advocate to help protect them from extinction. So, welcome, Dr. Rick. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So your shift in career, it actually led to you and sometimes your wife traipsing through forests in Indonesia and across Africa. I can't imagine all the stories you have to tell, but that might be a good place to start. Tell us about one of your more memorable encounters with one of these great apes.
Okay, not to start on a sad note, but probably one of the most memorable encounters occurred while I was traveling in the Central African Republic and while I was trekking with the Baka, the indigenous folks, while they were guiding me to see a family. On the second day, we returned to a spot that we expected this gorilla family with the head male, the so-called silverback, ready and waiting for us. And we did indeed, after a long and arduous trek, we did arrive at the scene only to find a rather agitated silverback. Mayali is his name. And soon we understood that he was anxious because we had noticed a female and only the two, the rest of the family was elsewhere. The female was very obviously quite ill. And with my camera ready to in anticipation of the whole family being there, the guides were excited that at least I saw the silverback male and one female. But the veterinarian side of me kicked in pretty quickly, and I recognized that this wasn't a happy scenario, that there was something clearly wrong. And the silverback was there to basically protect this ailing female. And so we decided, no, I wasn't going to be videoing or photographing this, that we'd best, for the sake of the gorillas, we'd best go back and alert them that this was a problem. So we did call off the rest. We drove back, hiked back, and within a couple of days, I had heard that the little female had in fact died and was the result of an overwhelming kind of parasite burden. So a little bit of a sad story, but one that it stood out in my mind because it's just what you would expect, a human family to do, to stay and protect the individual who wasn't quite right, and the others carried on, and undoubtedly Mayali, the silverback male, would have caught up with the rest of the group.
You talked about how he was reacting much like you would expect humans to react, and like I said off the top, right, you look into those eyes and it looks like you're looking into a pair of human eyes. So how actually closely are humans linked to great apes?
Well, quite closely. In fact, we share a what they call a last common ancestor. So we did not descend from great apes such as orangutans or bonobos or chimpanzees or gorillas, but rather we shared a common ancestor, and those specific great apes would have split off from that last common ancestor at varying periods. So orangutans were the first, so if you will, the most distant of those relatively close great ape relatives. And that was something around 15 to 19 million years ago that their ancestor split off. The human ancestor, sorry, the gorillas ancestor split off next, somewhere around 9 to 11 million years ago. And interestingly, the human ancestor was next to split off, probably about 5 to 8 million years ago. And
Oh, relatively recently.
it is, exactly. And the last to define themselves would have been chimpanzees and bonobos. So, and they were somewhere around 800,000 to 2.5 million years ago. So, those would be the closest. So, all of them as a group, as a family, if you will, great apes, all of them are quite close. Genetically, bonobos would be the closest, and we share about 98.4% of our DNA with bonobos and chimpanzees.
Wow. So is that what makes great apes great? The fact that we have this common ancestor and we share so much DNA with them?
I suspect that there's kind of a scientific answer, and then, of course, there's people need to choose the name. So,
Yeah, because I have been doing some reading and there's also the term lesser apes and I'm like as a human, I'm happy that we fit into the great apes category.
well, the interesting thing, Kathy, is even though I was a veterinarian, I was mostly in a small animal practice and definitely focused on eye problems as an eye specialist. So I had to relearn a lot of things that I knew at one point. But once I started to write the book, I thought, well, I at least better get it straight for myself first. So primates were all primates, and that's called the order when you look at the classification system. Family is the next group, and best way to kind of get to understand that is zebras and horses, clearly not the same species, they are in the same family. So similarly, great apes are a family and lesser apes are a family. And lesser apes are things like gibbons. Monkeys and lemurs and so on are all a different family. So the great apes are a family. And those great apes, as we mentioned, would be you and I. There would be gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and bonobos.
You mentioned your book a couple of times, and we will talk about it a little bit more. I'm working my way through it, but in it, you talk about how gorillas are a flagship species. So, what makes a gorilla a flagship species, or what is a flagship species?
Okay, so it's a term that suggests that there's something special about them. And people could argue that even the lowly moth or centipede in the forest is important as well. But in terms of what draws people's attention to them, in terms of how important they are in the ecosystem, appreciate that if a gorilla is which are mostly herbivores, so they eat plants. So as they're munching on trees and swallowing seeds, and they poop down the, I was going to say down the road, but a little further along in the forest, they're spreading seeds. They are actually pruning trees as they climb these trees and break off weaker branches, stimulating new growth. So the flagship species refers both to their importance in the whole ecosystem and kind of as a sentinel or an indicator that, hey, something's really wrong with the habitat. One of the things we fail to realize is that they need a specific type of tree or plants to survive. And if there's deforestation or other reasons for those not being in abundance, then they can't live. So they can't breed, they can't keep their population up.
You talked about deforestation. There's a lot, particularly going on in Indonesia. Are we at risk of losing any of these great apes?
Absolutely. And most of the challenges are human related. In other words, it is mostly human activities that affect their environment. So extractive industries like deforestation that you referred to in Indonesia for palm oil, there's extractive industries such as oil, looking for these critical minerals that we need for our cell phones from the Congo and so on. Those destroy the habitat. Imagine a pristine forest, and suddenly you're driving in with machinery, you're cutting down huge swaths of trees for roads, you're bringing in people who carry disease. And those people need to eat, and so they will hunt the bushmeat or the wildlife for food. All those things combine to reduce numbers. And certainly there are chronic disease, there's stress, there are other reasons as well. But most of it, unfortunately, has to points back to you and I.
That's not the first time I've heard that hosting this podcast, whether it's about the great apes or other species. The populations, and you did say that some are at risk. We're at risk of losing some. So which ones are most at risk? Which ones kind of need our most attention right now?
The group, the abbreviation is IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They create and continue to update the so-called red list, which gives people some idea of whether animals are, populations, I should say, and numbers are a concern, whether they're endangered, or whether they are critically endangered. And critically endangered is just one short step away from extinction. I would say that the values change over time, but safe to say that all of the great apes, I guess, except for people, all of the great apes are either endangered or critically endangered, and therefore a major concern.
So, where do you stand then on the subject of ecotourism? There are the gorilla treks in Uganda, Rwanda, I think, as well. I know I've gone on orangutan treks in Indonesia. Is it good? Is it not so good? Is it somewhere in between?
There is definitely a place for ecotourism, and in as long as it's done well and there are guardrails to the whole process, then at the very least it creates an awareness. And what we come to understand is that it's only once we're aware of what's going on that we know enough to care about it. Jane Goodall had a very famous saying, which I won't try to repeat verbatim, but it basically said, if you don't understand the problem, you won't know enough to even care about the problem, never mind figure out what to do to solve the problem. But see, the idea here is that, again, as long as precautions are taken, the local communities, they are entitled to benefit from their wildlife, and they do, as long as it's, again, as long as it's done well. So people in the local villages that used to be hunters and trappers, all of a sudden they become guides or porters for people like you and I to trek up these mountains in East Africa or Indonesia or wherever. And so those folks are, there's an opportunity created so they can partake in this. When we look at governments, they really only pay attention when there's an economic benefit. So when we look at, well, which countries have the best protection for wildlife, typically it is those from which they have derived an economic benefit and figured out that sort of balance. Now, the balance is there because they are, the downside of being so closely related genetically is that they are susceptible to human diseases and they would not have been exposed to them. So if the person goes and they have influenza and they're on the trek and they blow their nose into a Kleenex and discard that on the forest floor, and the curious chimpanzee or mountain gorilla picks it up, then that is a real concern. So typically there are best practice guidelines that suggest only an hour is how long you would spend to not disrupt the gorilla family, for example, as you're observing them, a limit on the age and the number. People leave their backpacks behind. They can bring cameras, but they don't bring their lunch and so on. And they keep that distance of, I think it's 15 feet or something like that. So as long, and they're not supposed to go if they're not well.
Right.
So there are guidelines. It's not without risk. Undoubtedly, disasters can and have happened. Having said that, in the big picture, how do we ensure that these populations thrive and go forward? A lot of it is about education. A lot of it is when you and I go and take pictures, we come back and show it to others, and they at the very least say, wow, I can't believe how much they look like, my son's birthday party from 2 years ago, when they see all the gathering and so on. So it's important. It builds some degree of empathy, and it does allow governments to prioritize their care and protection.
Yeah, so a couple of questions off of what you were just saying there, and you were saying that the local villagers, some of them become porters or guides, and they used to be hunters. So does that mean they are no longer hunting these great apes because they see the financial benefits to becoming a guide or a porter?
Absolutely. And the difficulty is that these folks we're talking about are, subsistence farmers. These are little tiny villages that go right up to the edge of the mountain, or in some cases continue onto the mountain. If you are struggling to feed your family and you have a gun and you can kill a gorilla who perhaps has even been raiding your garden, because they literally are next door, then that will feed a lot. Whereas if you provide a steady income, and that particular subsistence farm family has a way to feed their families from funding from work revenue, then they can purchase other meat or protein sources. So it is important, and it also allows for a change in the norm. It becomes less likely that they would just arbitrarily shoot a chimpanzee that was breaking into their garden and raiding it. What they would do then is they would say, hey, we'll phone the local NGO, that gorilla doctors or whatever they might be, and say, hey, we've got this nuisance chimpanzee or gorilla, and they will go out and relocate them, and it's a happy ending. Otherwise, they're killed.
And then through all of those actions, they're also helping to educate and raise awareness among the other villagers in their vicinity, right? So it's kind of this potential snowball effect. The other question that I had too was on the many treks that you've done, how do the gorillas or the chimpanzees or the orangutans, how do they react to having people standing 15 feet away with cameras and staring at them doing their daily business?
So that's a really good question. And Kathy, the whole process for them to become what we call habituated to this intrusion, because that's what it is, it takes several years. And so they would have, the wildlife folks would, gradually spend a little more time. And they know, the gorillas, for example, know that this is only going to last an hour. And while they may not know there are 60 minutes in an hour, I can tell you they know when someone is there longer than they should be. They know if somebody is there, and they become suspicious of that. If that hour becomes 2 or 3 hours, then they perhaps think back to when hunters were chasing them, and they become worried about it. And that goes for viewing elephants or chimpanzees. There's an innate kind of clock that says, okay, we've become used to accepting up to this point, but beyond that, not. And again, it takes a few years, and it takes building up trust, and it takes quite a lot of perseverance. And it's only a certain number of people. I know once when I was visiting in the Central African Republic and looking at bonobos leaving before dawn and hiking for a couple of hours. And when the sun came up, the bonobos who spent the night in nests up in the trees, they weren't coming down the first couple of days that a colleague and I were there. And when I said, well, like, how do they know? Don't they realize I've just come all this way and I really want to get their pictures and tell their stories? And more than one guide said, no, they see that you're not normally part of the group. And so that difference makes them leery. So they are amazingly perceptive.
I'm speaking with Dr. Rick Quinn, a retired veterinarian from southwestern Ontario, whose n- main passion in life, if I could say it that way, is now to help conserve and preserve the great ape population. And how did you fall into this world in the first place?
well, there should be some great, empathetic story or something behind that. But to be honest, I came across an article from a trade magazine on my desk. And finally, I thought, I'm going to clear this desk. What's in this? Why have I kept this magazine for so long? And lo and behold, there was an article on a talk that this group of veterinarians called the gorilla doctors, who, as the name suggests, look after gorillas in East Africa. They had given a talk, and I thought, wow, isn't this wouldn't that be neat to go and visit them and see what they do? And so I called a similarly crazy colleague in Michigan, and David and I decided that we would travel and we would give some lectures, and that would sort of be our way to bribe is not a nice word, but that would be our way to make sure that we were offering something, and maybe we could get our picture taken with a gorilla looking into their eye. We had no idea. He's an ophthalmologist as well. So we went, and they had so many veterinarians, retired folks, former staff members, receptionists. All of them came out of the forest to listen to our talks. And at the end of it, we thought, gee, we have a lot more that we should be able to offer other than our rusty lectures on how to examine eyes. So we certainly did teach them a lot of eye things about the wildlife they would see, but it sparked an interest that has obviously expanded quite a bit. So a lot of this originated as, wow, they do so much, those veterinarians do so much with so little. They don't have the opportunities for continuing professional education, for buying equipment at trade shows that most people in North America or Europe would just go to those 2 or 3 times a year. They just don't have access to that sort of stuff. So we thought, well, we'll get together and use our connections and our contacts to help advance what they do and what we could sense they were really wanting to be able to do.
Okay, so you took that and you buddied up with your pal and you guys created Docs for Great Apes, a nonprofit. And when I was looking at the website and your mission in that, and the difference you're trying to make really focuses around education. And why do you think that education is what change hinges on?
For the same reason that when the former hunters became trackers and guides, that's what opens people's eyes. And believe me, there is a lot that is already being done by those African veterinarians and folks that work in these NGOs on the front lines, and they literally risk their lives like on a daily basis, no exaggeration. There's lots being done, but what they don't have access to easily or affordably is to formally continue their education. So they certainly have veterinary schools and good ones, and we got to even lecture at for a couple of them. What we did not find was an easy way for the regular veterinarians that would work in a village, perhaps with livestock, a few with pets, but mostly livestock, goat, sheep, cattle. They had no way to be trained to look after the wildlife in their backyard. And it seemed so odd to us that, like, as a veterinarian, I drool over the thought that my career could have been dealing with giraffes and lions and chimpanzees, and they too would like that, but they just have no way to get that education. So the interest is there, incredibly smart and absolutely creative, but at some point there's a barrier, and we feel that the barrier to education is what's stopping most. There are is lots happening. It's a question of scaling it up and making some kind of effort to standardize it. And if there are people willing to fund that education and others that wish to do it, and universities that wonder what's the best way to train them, if those three groups can be sitting at the same table and figure it out, it's a lifetime of change.
So I'm just looking at my notes, and one of the initiatives you have underway, it's a conserve vet education project. And this one, it's focusing on developing the skill set of the local veterinarians that you were talking about. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Again, recognizing that right from the veterinary school level, where veterinary students in their third year or final year, they would need to have exposure, perhaps go out on some short-term project to see what a wildlife veterinarian would even do, perhaps write a paper as part of a course. So at the level of the student, and then at the level of the newly graduated or younger veterinarian, wouldn't it be great if they had the clinical skills to maybe spend a year, or the opportunity to develop clinical skills, spend a year with somebody else that does this, a so-called internship. And then finally, for those that are really keen and have done it for quite a while, having a formal education like a master's or a PhD level training that would enable them to do research, to figure out the right drugs to use, to write so others can benefit from their experience. So we decided that we would fund scholarships to make those happen. So our group organizes events, and this book has been helpful. It's been probably the main way that we raise funds. And for example, we just this past fall signed up a young lady who is from Uganda and a young fella who's from Tanzania, who had already been working on in the Serengeti with wildlife, and they're currently enrolled in a master's program in wildlife medicine at Makerere University in Uganda. So the benefits, Kathy, are that they totally dedicated, young, enthusiastic, and so they get the opportunity. Number one. Number two, it supports the university in Africa, East Africa, Uganda in this case. And number three, it will eventually allow them to train others. So it's kind of a win-win. So I believe we've sponsored 12 individuals to date for this kind of education and training.
So is that kind of the best way for someone who's listening to get involved? Because I can imagine, right? You're sitting in your comfortable house listening to the podcast and think, I live an ocean away. There's nothing that I can do to support. So would you encourage, whether it's this initiative or another organization's initiative, but is that kind of the best way to get involved?
Absolutely, and I credit Jane Goodall for a lot of things in this whole journey of mine. But Jane would always say that what every individual does matters, and when you get up in the morning and decide, well, is there something I can do? Forget the hopelessness and the helplessness. You can make a difference, and that difference might be choosing to substitute something that has palm oil. I think going back to the orangutans and what you saw in Indonesia. And some of us can travel to the area, support them by being actively involved in a trek. But also, if you're going on something that's supposedly eco-tourist like, make sure that the organizers, that something is going back into the local community, that it's not just going to a head office in North America or Europe or Australia, that there's actually benefit for the local community. And then many organizations, including our own, we have websites that people can donate to, and we do our best to keep people up to date, or keep the information up to date about who it is we're sponsoring. And they have their pictures there and their life story, and some of them are just amazing. It's very humbling to read what they've been through to get to do this, and so it's absolutely a thrill to be able to help them. Interestingly, we have a lot of veterinarians that say, well, I'd love to go over and volunteer to train. Well, that's not really what's necessary, even though we're after education. As a veterinarian with decades of experience here in southwestern Ontario, I didn't have a whole lot that I could train them with. There are people that can train, that are trained themselves to pass this information along. It's to facilitate that, to make that happen. So, in our case, the book, the Just Like Us, has been a major fundraising effort, and it's available through chapters in Amazon and on our website and so on.
Yeah, and I have my copy of it here, and I'm working. I'm about halfway through it, and it's filled like with some just amazing photographs that I know you took a lot of the photographs. Your wife took some of the photographs. It's such an interesting read because there's humor interspersed throughout it as well, and the ordeals that that you ended up, you're sliding down a mountain on your butt kind of thing. Jane Goodall, you referenced her, and she actually wrote the foreword for this. And you became friends over the years, and you actually sit on the Jane Goodall Institute. And unfortunately, the world lost her this past year. What if there was one lesson or one takeaway that you have from your work with Jane, what would it be?
Well, she was a major influence, as I said before, and I'm not sure I would be doing what I'm doing now had it not been for that influence. What surprised me was, and as an individual, from a physical stature point of view, you would think that she would not be forceful at all. Having said that, I'm not sure I'd met that many people that could hold their own and politely argue their case and have people agreeing by the end almost uniformly, whether they were heads of state, heads of major companies, or guides and trackers, or people from the local village, and particularly kids. So she was very powerful in persuading people and getting her message out. What you would think would happen with somebody with her experience would be that they would try to convince them that what they were doing was wrong. And although that's what would happen in the end, the individual wouldn't realize that that's what happened until they probably thought about it later, because she always worked to find common ground. She would always say that, you're not right and they're not wrong. Everybody comes at this from a different viewpoint. So understand the other person's viewpoint. If you're going to build a bridge and affect change, recognizing that that change is probably going to have to be gradual, then you need to find the common denominator that you have. You need to reach out into that person's heart, she would say, and find out what is it that really is important to you, and I'll convince you that that's linked to what I'm trying to get you to change. So it's interestingly, I didn't learn anywhere near as much of things about primates or chimpanzees, but rather a way to view bridging the gap between people that you really do need to bridge a gap. She was an amazing diplomat. It's just incredible. I was very fortunate to have got to know her, and we got to know her quite well. She's held my grandchildren. She was on the ground on all fours, scratching our dog's belly. She was a pretty amazing woman.
And what will you miss most about her?
I think that smile. She was mischievous. There was no question about it, and lots of stories out there about her doing things that you just would not imagine. If we have time, I'll tell you one. Which
Sure. Yeah.
she was in London, the area that I live in, being awarded an honorary degree at Western. And the night before, we had organized at our home to have a fundraising event. And so there were 100 people, and we had a large tent. And I was advised ahead of time and knew that if we wanted her to enjoy herself, the event would have to have something to do with dogs. So, as a veterinarian and lots of contacts, I organized with some folks that had an agility interest, and they have an agility group with the tunnels and the dogs that go through the weave poles and up the teeter totters and so on and through the hoop. So we had an event that featured that, and at the end she asked for the microphone, and she was supposed to be the judge. She asked for the microphone and asked, would I mind if she did something incredibly silly? And I said, Jane, this is your party. You're welcome to do it, whatever you want. And so she called for a few volunteers and proceeded to ask them to follow her. And she went down on all four and crawled through the 20, 30-foot long tunnel from one end to the other, went through the hoop, through the weave poles, up the teeter totter, down the other side. And she was at the time, probably mid 80s. And
Oh
she
my gosh.
great time with all these folks following her. And I would get messages for the couple of years after saying, from her staff saying, "Oh, this is the anniversary, and this was Jane's favorite event." So, yeah, she was just off the wall at times, and always fun. And then she would look really seriously, and then would kind of just lift her lip and smile at you, and she was very charming for sure.
Oh, that's a side of Jane that I don't think many of us got to see. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, like I said, the foreword of your book is written by her. I don't think I did justice talking about it. So it's called Just Like Us, and this is like I love the photo on the cover because you could turn it, whichever way and it works, right? So give us it's called a veterinarian's visual memoir of our vanishing great ape relatives. So, if someone why would somebody wanna pick this up?
Well, the 100, so the practical answer is that 100% of the proceeds from the sale of this book has always gone to fund these scholarships. So it does not fund any retirement project of mine or anybody else's. 100% of the funds goes to these scholarships. Number one. Number two, it to understand how the book evolved, it began with photographs that I took from that very first time that we gave the lectures and then went out on these treks, and talking to people. At that time, it was just the mountain gorillas, of the Diane Fossey kind of fame. And as time went on, I thought, well, there are other great apes out there, and so I would make contacts and go and see some others, and some of them are very challenging to get to. So I had many people, many other NGOs like the Wildlife Conservation Society and so on, that over time would hear that I've worked with Jane and the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada, and they would allow me to do things that I know that most people, most tourists would not get to do. So I would travel along with their research groups and have access to things that most people wouldn't have.
Right.
And many of these trackers that would bring me, they would put down logs to get this awkward white guy over this stream without him falling in and drowning. I mean, they loaned me boots. It was just incredible. They would help me carry all this stuff. And all they would ask at the end was, please make sure that these images make a difference somehow. They said they just like, we don't want this to just stay on a hard drive somewhere. This is important to us, prior to the internal conflict in the Congo. They had many tourists. Suddenly there were not as many. Please get those pictures out so you can see. And I know these folks went out of their way to help me. And so it became, well, you know what? I need to do something to give back and address this privileged position. And I've been able to be in there and for the rest of my life, to be honest. And so it became more of a passion to, well, let's do this. And then it became, well, if I were to write a book, I can't list 4 out of 5 of these great apes and say, well, whatever happened to, why didn't you talk about Western lowland gorillas or whatever? So it became kind of, well, okay, now I'm driven to see all of them and get images that are shareable with all of them. And I honestly thought that, a weekend or two going through my favorite images, write up a few of these stories, and there's a book. Well, I can tell you that 2 years later, I was thinking, what on earth was I even thinking? It is literally sort of it begins with, well, why do we even care? What are great apes? Kind of like this story on this really enjoyable conversation has gone, is like, well, okay, so what's this all about? Why does it matter? And what's a great ape anyways? And it's written at a level where it keeps people's interest, but it's written so my 95-year-old Aunt Doreen could understand it as well. It's not a primatology 101 course, that's for sure.
I can attest to that because I'm reading it and I am not a primatologist and I am understanding it. So it's good.
That's success then. Thank you. And so, but it does chronicle the reasons for these visits, the happy times, the sad episodes, and why it matters. And it tells the story that the people who help me make it possible couldn't tell themselves. And it's not that they didn't want to, it's just they don't have the ability to, they don't have the audience. And so I'm really quite proud of it. I really think that it came together well. I think it's a really for somebody that is interested in wildlife or in the role nature plays, or is even just curious. I hope they enjoy it. That's what it was meant to do. Again, it's kind of once the teacher, always the teacher. It's just a way to get that story out, and it's been quite successful to date.
Yeah, it's an amazing like coffee table book, right? Just you have guests over and they pick it up and start flicking through all the photos that are in it, right? And then who knows where it goes from there. All right, Dr. Rick Quinn, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating, enchanting conversation.
Well, it's my pleasure, Kathy. As you can tell, I'm relatively passionate about this, and it's nice to have the opportunity and folks like you and at Salthaven, I mean, whose hearts are in the right place. That makes a big difference in our troubled world. So, thank you for what you do and what Salthaven does. And yes, it's been nice to get to meet you and talk with you.
And for those who are listening, if you want to learn more about Docs for Great Apes, I will make sure to include the link to the website in the notes. And if there's a particular animal that you would like us to focus on in an upcoming episode of Wild About Wildlife, just let me know. You can email me at wildaboutwildlife.org. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate your support, and together we can keep the wild in wildlife.